Stone, CEO of KCSARC, and it's wonderful to have all of you here today. I'm really excited about this webinar that we're doing. The question of what do I say when someone tells me they've been a victim of sexual assault, that's a question that so many people have. And I'm happy to have a panel of 3 experts, our prevention team, who's going to talk you through why people disclose, what we can do as friends, family members, coworkers, colleagues to really help people once they tell us that. The format here is something we've seen before. We'll have about 30 minutes for a conversation. Questions, of course, go into the chat. We will have Q&A for probably about 15 minutes towards the end of our presentation. We have a hard stop at 12:45. So listen, put your questions in. There'll be a lot of follow-up information as well. So with that, I am pleased to turn this over to Chris Johnson, Director of Prevention for KCSARC.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. Yes, my name is Chris Johnson. I'm the Director of Prevention Services with KCSARC. I'm also a mental health therapist and have been a mental health therapist with KCSARC for a number of years. And I would like to introduce you to my colleagues, Jessica and Hannah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Pepin. I am a prevention services specialist here at KCSARC. I'm also a mental health therapist and previously worked with adolescents in that capacity.
Good morning, or good afternoon, I guess. My name is Jessica. I am also a prevention services specialist like Hannah. I started at KCSARC as a legal advocate, so that is what my background is in as well.
Excellent. So yes, today we want as a team to sort of share some tips on how to support someone when they tell you that they have been a victim or a survivor of sexual assault. A quick note on the language I'm going to be using today. I am going to be using the terms victor and survivor interchangeably. And that is to represent the various ways in which people who experience abuse or assault choose to identify. So those words will be used interchangeably. So whether you are an adolescent, an adult, a parent, a friend, a partner, or a teacher, this protocol that we're going to walk you through today is a victim-centered approach in handling a disclosure of sexual assault or sexual abuse. The protocol is called BASER, and we will walk you through every aspect of this. I would also like to add that while this protocol is important for mandatory reporters, this is not going to be a training on mandatory reporting or any of the legal obligations of a mandated reporter. This training is meant to supplement whatever protocols or policies your workplace or institution follow regarding the reporting process. But I will, however, point out a couple of mandated reporter-specific suggestions sort of towards the end of this training on this protocol. So with all that being said, let's get going. Why do we teach this protocol? One of the reasons why we teach this protocol to adults in particular is because providers like myself are always telling kids, you know, if somebody's hurting you, if somebody's making you uncomfortable, to go tell a trusted adult. So we want to make sure that the trusted adults that we keep telling our kids to go seek help from actually know what to do and how best to do it. And because adults wear many hats, it's also important to know how to support the other people in your life, be it a partner, a spouse, or a friend. And we teach this protocol to middle and high school students because one of the things that I consistently hear from youths who've experienced abuse is that the very first person that they told was not a parent, not a guardian, or some other trusted adult. It is a friend. It was a peer, somebody their own age, maybe an older sibling. But regardless of the relationship, it's often another youth who will serve as that first responder in handling disclosures of abuse or assault. You know, and of course, after this initial disclosure, many of the times the child does proceed to tell a trusted adult or a parent or a guardian, but that first point of contact is often another youth. So this brings me to my first point, and that is that everyone who receives a disclosure of abuse or assault can play an outsized role in shaping the way that that victim begins to understand and make sense of their experience. Now, as a trauma therapist for sexual assault survivors, I have learned to listen to very specific things as a person describes their experience. And aside from the experience and the details of the traumatic event itself, the other areas of interest I have is hearing about their experience of disclosing. Because I want to know who they told. I want to know when they told. I want to know why they told, how they told. But more importantly, I want to know what the response was from the person that they told. I mean, best case scenario is that following a disclosure, a survivor is going to feel supported. They're going to feel believed, relieved. They're going to feel empowered, and they're going to have access to any resources that they may need, as well as possibly opening up an opportunity for a meaningful intervention with the perpetrator. Now, the worst case scenario of disclosure is that a survivor walks away feeling shamed, judged, disbelieved, or blamed for their assault. They tell nobody else, they don't get their needs met, and their assailant or perpetrator goes on to commit more harm. Now, I know of somebody who was 15 years old when they were sexually abused. And the very first person they told about the assault told them that it was God's punishment for them drinking. The next person that they told was their therapist 48 years later, having lived their entire life with symptoms of PTSD because of how that disclosure was handled. So it matters. How we support those who trust us enough to tell us something so personal and sensitive matters. So before we get into this protocol itself, I want to mention some of the various contexts in which people may disclose their abuse. And once again, I'm drawing from my own experience as a therapist, as an advocate. I know that there is no one reason why somebody decides to disclose their experience of abuse or who they decide to disclose their experience to. I mean, there is numerous reasons. A survivor may disclose because they're suffering from the abuse and they need help reporting and they trust you to help keep them safe. But maybe they're deciding to share their experience with you because they want to be understood and they think that you will gain a better insight into them. Maybe they want to connect with you and they know that you have a similar history or experience. Or maybe they're trying to make sense of what happened to them and they think that you are a safe or a smart or non-judgmental person who might be able to help sort this out with them, help define what happened to them. Or it's also possible that maybe they have just held their secret in for so long that they simply could no longer contain it and they just burst and you just happen to be the person in the room when it all comes pouring out. There is no one reason why people tell or who they tell. So with all that being said, I want to shift a little bit of our conversation to talk about some of the common emotional responses someone may have following a sexual assault and how this protocol that we're going to talk about can mitigate the impact of some of those common emotional responses. So for that, I'm going to turn this over to Hannah.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Chris. Yes, so when we teach this protocol, we transition into it by firstly talking about common responses. So common responses are feelings, experiences, things that a victim might experience after sexual violence in response to what happened. So not every victim will experience these, not everyone will experience them in the same ways, at the same times, or even with the same people. So like Chris said, these responses can also be impacted and depend on how a disclosure goes and how somebody handles it when it's shared. So as I said, every victim is different, and this webinar is going to provide some ways to show support to a variety of people through the BASER protocol. But first, it's important to know these responses. So there are 3 common responses I'm going to go through, and it's important to know them because they provide a window into the type of support that a victim, survivor of sexual violence might need, and also might validate many of the ways that you're already all probably supporting people in your lives. So the 3 common responses that we discuss with students in classrooms, with community groups, and generally just with folks like you all who want to better understand how to support people are betrayal, powerlessness, and shame. So first, I'll go through betrayal. And why might a victim of sexual assault experience betrayal after an assault? Well, we know that the majority of sexual assaults are committed by somebody known to the victim, somebody like a dating partner, a family member, close friend, sibling. Chris named some folks too. And what is an extremely important element of the relationships between those people? Trust, right? So talking about betrayal, it can be pretty obvious that victims may feel betrayed if the person who perpetrated the violence against them is somebody that they know, like, or love and trust, which the majority of the time it is. So that person they trusted with personal information, access to their space, their body, and the offender took advantage of that relationship and that trust. So a really common response the victims will feel is betrayed. Secondly is powerlessness. So the second common response is victims will often feel powerless after they've been sexually assaulted. Victims will feel this way because of a loss of agency, loss of say, of choice. Sexual assault is a crime of power and control. It's not about sex. Many of us know that, right? So people who perpetrate sexual assault do it to take power from someone else or wield their power in an extremely harmful way. Therefore, when someone is sexually assaulted, a common response is feeling powerless, like their power was taken from them because it was. The third common response is shame. So lastly, shame is one of those emotions everyone knows, right? I'm sure all of us can understand that feeling of shame. You don't like it. You can tell when you're feeling it. It can be confused with guilt, right? But instead, shame faces inward, right? And it focuses on the self. So shame can often come off as self-judgment. And for victims, it often comes up as questions like, what's wrong with me? Why wasn't I strong enough to fight back? Why can't I just get over it? Shame does a really good job of making a victim feel like it was their fault that they were assaulted. Often, shame can feed off of messages that a victim has already received from people in their lives, possibly from the offender, also from media, right? I mean, I'm sure we can all name questions like, what were you wearing? Why did you go to that party? He was your boyfriend. I didn't think you could be assaulted by your boyfriend, right? And sometimes, as I said, the offender will use shame to keep a victim silent or make them feel like it was their fault, which reinforces messages that they may already be telling themselves. Shame is tough because it doesn't go away in silence or isolation, where we all want to keep it most of the time, right? If anything, it grows in that silence. So when someone feels like an assault was their fault, they may not feel like they deserve support and might not seek it. Which leads into why all of these three responses, so shame, betrayal, powerlessness, can all also come up for a victim when they disclose, depending on how that disclosure goes. So as Chris discussed, people disclose for a whole host of reasons, right? And depending on how that person they disclose to responds, the victim can feel any of those three common responses. So for instance, if someone responds by not believing the victim, questioning what they did to cause that to happen to them, siding with the perpetrator, which we know is quite common if people know both parties, right? People know everyone who's involved, sharing the victim's story without their consent, so not checking in and asking what the victim needs. All of those things can break their trust. And all of those things, most of those things, some of those things can be done in a well-meaning way, right? So we all want to support folks who come to us, but we just may not know how. And it can totally be accidental if you've done any of these things. Also, if a victim tells someone what happened, it's really common and can be common and kind of knee-jerk to want to jump in and help, right? As somebody responding to a disclosure to want to solve the problem and get that victim on the path to healing. But what does jumping to action and making decisions for the victim do to the victim? It takes their power away again, right? So there's that powerlessness that can come up in the way that a disclosure is handled. It's important to be mindful of that. and not jump in without checking in with the victim to see what they need. Victim blaming, questioning, not believing someone, all of the things that I've been explaining the past few minutes can reinforce shame too, because that person was probably already questioning those things themselves. So of course, it's really normal for us to want to make sense of what happened, let somebody know that we care when they tell us they were hurt. But oftentimes the way that we do it could cause more harm to the victim and either make them feel betrayed, ashamed, or even more powerlessness. So those 3 common responses, really important to keep in mind and understand if you are in the position of somebody coming to you and disclosing that they were harmed, that they were sexually assaulted. It'll better equip us to be supportive and compassionate in the face of hearing really difficult disclosures and stories from people. So shame, betrayal, powerlessness, important to keep in mind. Now, you're probably all wondering, well, what should I do? What should I do to counter some of these responses, to not do some of those things? And how can I handle a disclosure with care instead? And Jessica, I'll hand it off to, is here to tell you how to do that.
Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, so what are we supposed to do? We want to help the people in our life. We want to make them feel supported and cared for. So what are we supposed to do? We at KCSARC, I don't know if you know this, we love an acronym. Our name's even an acronym, but we use them a lot in teaching things just because it does make it easier for people to remember these things. So we use something called BASER, B-A-S-E-R, and I will go through and explain what these things mean and what each of those letters stand for. But it is essentially a universal precaution that we offer for supporting someone who discloses something to you. And I mean, this could truthfully be used for a lot of different things, but it is especially beneficial to be used when you're hearing a disclosure of sexual assault or sexual abuse. What we also know about BASER is that it doesn't have to look the same with everybody that you talk to. So depending on what that disclosure looks like, depending on who that person is and how you know them, these things can look different for different people. How you believe them, how you affirm, support, all of these things can look different. And unlike some of our other acronyms that we use, we also recognize that BASER doesn't have to be followed exactly every single time. So you don't need to check off, okay, I did B, I did A, okay, now I'm moving on to S. Whatever you feel is beneficial for that person at that moment during that time, that's going to be the best thing. This is just kind of a way that we use an acronym to center the other person instead of ourselves in these conversations. We want their needs and what they're saying to be heard and met, and less so about like doing things that are going to make us feel more comfortable in the situation. So let's go through the letters. B is to believe. So we want to start from a place of believing. I always say when I'm talking to students, like, none of you guys are detectives yet. You don't have to investigate your friends. If they're telling you something happened, listen to them, believe them. Because some of those questions that Hannah mentioned earlier that could lead to things like shame, those could be coming from a well-meaning person trying to understand the situation or what happened. But you don't need to get all the evidence. You don't need to decide whether or not you're going to trust that they are telling the truth, because that's not what they need. You can start from a place of believing. And then affirm. So I believe you, it was not your fault, and you did the right thing by telling me. So affirming that they did nothing to cause this to happen, and that they made the right choice in talking to you about it, that you are thankful that they are sharing this information with you, and that you don't think that anything that happened to them was their fault. So going back a little bit, BASER, we like to say, is the base to the acid that is the common responses of sexual assault. So when you are trying to neutralize an acid, you need a base. And things like believing and affirming directly counteract shame and betrayal. If somebody believes me and I can trust that I made the right choice in talking to this person, that will directly counteract some of those common responses, which is what we're trying to do with this protocol. So believing, affirming, supporting, you want to follow their lead. That's the most important part about supporting. Ask them, what do you need from this? Do you need me to listen to you? Do you need me to help you take action? Do you need me to give you advice? Or like, I just need to sit here and not say anything and you just need to get this off your chest? Because, right, we talked about how people disclose for different reasons. So they're gonna need different things. But the important part about support is that you're listening to that person and what they need. And you're not assuming what they need because of what you think you should be doing or what you think they should be doing. This will directly counteract powerlessness and betrayal, right? You are giving that power back to them. And by doing that and then not making decisions for them, not telling other people because you think that they should know, that will rebuild that trust for them. And they know that they can trust people in this world with their story, with what they want to do with that story. Empower. You show them that they have control and power over their story and what they choose to do with that story and what they choose to do with what happened to them. So we want to empower people to make their own choices in this system as much as we can. Chris will talk a little bit later about what that looks like when that's not able to happen as much, but as much as we can, we want to empower them to make their own choices. And we want to show them that when they make those choices, we're still going to be there to support them, regardless of what those choices are. Even if I don't think that that is what I would have done in that situation, it doesn't matter. That's what your choice is. And I'm going to be here to support you no matter what that decision is. And then the last one is refer. So out of all of these letters, refer is kind of the main point for that other person receiving the disclosure. And this is when we have to know ourselves and know when something is too much for us as an individual. I don't have the capacity for this. I don't think I can help you in the best way. I have done everything that I can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that there are other people whose job it is to help you through this and support you in all these different ways that I don't think that I can. So referring is really making sure that that person's needs are also met in a way that we as peers, as friends, as family may not be able to meet those needs just because it's not like I'm not a professional, right? I don't know what to tell you or how to make you feel better or how to work through a therapeutic protocol with you, but I know somebody who does. And so I'm going to make sure that you are given resources and referred to people that can help you more than I can. And like I mentioned at the beginning, right, this doesn't have to be followed exactly all the time. So if all you can do is say, I believe you, you didn't deserve to have this happen to you, and I'm going to help you find somebody to help you with it, that's great. That is probably exactly what a lot of people would need to hear. So again, you don't have to remember each letter, but this is just a way that you center that other person and make sure that we are trying to counteract a lot of those common responses to sexual assault and sexual abuse. So with the R, I will turn it back over to Chris, who's going to explain how referrals can look sometimes and when you're referring to certain people, what those people might be required to do, but also how you can keep Phaser in mind while you're doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica, Hannah. That's really good explanation of this. And this is just sort of wrapping this up a little bit. I wanted to add this piece around mandatory reporting. We do a lot of work in schools. We do a lot of work with folks who are mandated reporters, and we do teach them this protocol. And like I said, this protocol isn't to like, is really only to supplement any procedure or policy that they have in place already. But there are specific things that we believe here at KCSARC that counselors, mandated reporters, teachers can do specifically around the empowering piece of handling a disclosure when they have to by law report something. So things to keep in mind as a mandated reporter is that it is always going to be very informative, empowering, helpful to explain the process. Now, I know that a lot of schools and institutions' policies on reporting are confusing, and even the people who are receiving disclosures are not always clear what that process is. But the more succinct and clearly you can tell that person who disclosed to you what the follow-up is going to look like, the process of reporting, that is more information is going to be helpful to them. Asking that person if they would like to be present while the report is made. Sometimes that can really counter also not only that empowerment bit, but of that trust. If that child is old enough to be in the room with you, to hear how that report is made, the language that's being used to make sure that there wasn't other things being said or words were being misconstrued, that can also be a very empowering piece. Of course, following up with any kind of resources after the disclosure, super helpful. But another big piece, and I think this one is one that we know is important. We tell kids this a lot, and I think it's helpful for people who are making mandated reports, especially if you know that child doesn't want that report being made, is to let that kiddo know that even though you have to make a report, they do not have to be part of any follow-up investigation. They don't have to talk to anybody else if they choose not to do that. That's important information. So yes, you as a mandated reporter have to make this report. CPS, law enforcement may have to come out. They want to come out. They may have to do an interview, but it's important to let that person know they do not have to participate in that investigation if they choose not to do that. So anyway, those pieces around mandated reporting, I just want to throw out there. Like I said, those are just little pieces to keep in mind. One final thing before we sort of open this up to Q&A is I just want to throw out there too that we have a podcast here at KCSARC that goes into this topic and as well as other topics that we are teaching in the classroom. So anyone who would like to hear this or other things more than once, who would want to share this conversation with others, you can check out the Link to Prevention podcast. It's available on our website. I'm sure they'll be able to put a link in the chat for that. And you can also just access it on whatever streaming channel or format you get your podcast on. So with that, I would like to toss this back over to Mary Ellen at this time.
Okay. Chris, Hannah, Jessica, thank you so much. Really helpful information. And I've been doing the work for a while, but it's helpful to be just reminded of all of this. So thank you. And this is where all of us, when we talk about it in the breakfast and other events, we say everybody can help victims and survivors, and we're all part of this whole effort. So it's not just KCSARC, it's all of us. So this is really practical. I've got some questions already from people, and I'm just going to pop them or put them back to Chris and Jessica and Hannah. And if you've got questions, please put them in the chat. But one of the questions that comes up often, and I think maybe especially after this one, is like, okay, so a friend of mine shared her experience with me. I really messed it up. What do I do now? Do I go back and try and fix it? What do I do? So what should people do if this happens? Because it does happen a lot. Okay, who's going to answer that? Hannah.
I can answer. It does happen a lot. And I think first, sort of like what I was going through with common responses is it's going to happen, right? We're not going to handle this perfectly every time. The three of us talk about it a lot. Like, yes, we professionally know how to do this. And personally, it's still really hard when somebody comes to you. And if you do feel like you messed up, you feel like you said something wrong, I would say it's always okay to go back and circle back and acknowledge, hey, I don't think that I really came across as believing you when you told me that, and I'm so sorry, and I do believe you. So I don't think this is a protocol that, if you feel like you did it wrong one time, you can't go back and fix it. and believe that person.
Okay.
And could I just add that I
Yeah, please.
also, I mean, we as a team have also seen how powerful that is when a school in particular acknowledges that mistake. We've seen schools who have not handled disclosure well, have done a retrospective on it, realized where errors were made, and they went back to that person who made that disclosure and let them know, hey, we know we did not do this well, and we are going to be doing this better again in the future.
Yeah, that makes, I mean, there's that humility that we need. So that makes a whole lot of sense. Let me put out another question that came up, and I'm glad to see some questions coming up in chat, but sort of a variation on this is what happens if, say, we're in a group setting, you know, whether it's a party or something, and somebody says something publicly and you're saying, what do I say now? How do I deal with this in a public setting? You know, like, do we just keep on with the conversation, or I mean, what do you do in something like that?
I can
Who's
answer
going
this
to
one.
go for it, Jessica?
So yeah, that happens a lot more than we probably think that it does. And so it also kind of goes back to what Chris was saying earlier about like why people disclose and why they choose the settings that they do to disclose. So like depending on how well you know that person, like you might know why they chose that space or that time to be disclosing at that point. And I would say in general, the best thing to do is just kind of follow up with them afterwards, one-on-one. So, and if you know kind of the reason why they were disclosing at that point in that way, that will kind of help you to lead that conversation. Like, hey, I noticed that you dropped this. Is this because of this reason? I would love if you would want to tell me more about why that happened, or what you meant by that, or why. Yeah, I want to know more. Are you willing to talk to me a bit about what we just heard or what you just said? And like sometimes they're going to say no, and that's okay. And just know, like, just letting them know, like, hey, I heard it. I'm here for you if you want to talk about it. And then letting them kind of follow that lead with whether or not they want to discuss it further.
Yeah, that makes really good sense. I mean, it's that acknowledgement piece. Like you said it, I heard it. So we don't pretend that it didn't happen. I think that, thanks. That's super helpful, Jessica. There are a couple of questions in chat, and this is sort of a two-part one having to do with vulnerable populations and interactions with law enforcement. So let me read this to you and you decide who's going to answer. Is there advice for handling cases with adults who are in vulnerable populations such as trans, people of color, undocumented, in which interactions with police could be harmful or detrimental? How do you navigate the benefits and harms of reporting, and what support can you give adults can you give adults trying to make a decision that's best for them? I know we get calls like this a lot.
So I can take a chance. I can try that. So I mean, I think the question is, it sounds, I was maybe hearing this wrong, but I think the question, based on the second part of the question, is that it's talking about youth populations, or is it the vulnerable adult populations? The vulnerable adult population. Okay, so if we are talking about adult protective services, I'm assuming, or law enforcement, as far as making those calls, and to be the determining factor in mitigating risk based on who may be the follow-up. I think that's the question.
I think it's like, or how not a number of people have very mixed interactions with law enforcement. It's really, I think, how do you help people decide, should I report or not? And especially if you're in, as this person's saying, a vulnerable population, we know that it's even more complicated. So it's how do you decide, how do you help somebody decide what to do next?
And I can take this, Chris, if you
want. Sure. No, go ahead.
Because I had a lot of these conversations.
The legal advocate, go. Yes.
So, I mean, I think it is, part of it is obviously the relationship that you have with that person, and letting them know that, like, there are so many supports that you can get to to deal with anything that might be lingering because of an assault that don't involve reporting to law enforcement. So like you can get therapy at KCSARC without having to have an open report. Your friends and your family can get information on how best to support you without having an open report. And I mean, truthfully, I would say if you don't have this knowledge yourself, referring them to a legal advocate, talking to a legal advocate doesn't necessarily have to instigate a police report. They can talk to that person about the benefits and the harms of reporting and what that process might look like for them specifically in their population or how they identify or whatever it is. We have so many different legal advocates that know exactly what that's going to look like for a person, and they can talk them through how much they want to participate in. If there are things that they don't want to do, but there are things that they do want to do. I mean, there are so many people with so much information and knowledge for those people that can get that support without having to make a police report or go through law enforcement, because we do recognize that there are so many people who don't have good relationships and do not have a good experience with law enforcement. And so, yeah, just letting them know that there are so many supports that they can get without having to make a report, and also that there are people that they can talk to if that is something that they want to do.
Just could you just underscore something that has been a value for KCSARC from the beginning and continues to be a value today, which is it's the victim's choice as to what they want to do, and we will do everything in our power to honor that choice, whether that's and so if it's reporting or not, we're going to lay that out. We are advocates for victims. We are not part of the system for a reason. We are independent for a reason, so that we can be an advocate for the victim and what they choose, and give them as much power and autonomy and agency as we possibly can. And there's another question about, yes, I mean, and so services are available at no cost. We'll make sure that everybody gets follow-up information on how to connect with us.
Yes.
So absolutely, absolutely.
You know, one more point too is, while we talk about services at no cost, which is completely true, and we tell folks this all the time, kids this all the time. The other thing that I think is also important for adults to, another message important for adults to relay to kids around reporting and getting resources, is that reminder that age 13 is the age of consent for mental health supports in Washington State for youth. And again, so that means that kiddos, and this is something we reinforce in the classrooms, that kids can seek support at no cost without parental consent if need be, through our agency. Because we know that sometimes parents are not supportive of mental health treatment. Sometimes parents are the perpetrators of the abuse. And our state recognizes that kids at age 13 have the ability to consent for their own mental health treatment. And we at KCSARC are willing to work with those kids who have no other source of support or a way of paying for that support.
Yeah, good point. You know, another question that's come up, and we've sort of touched on this already, is when somebody, you know, if I'm a person not in my role here, actually even in my role here, right? We all have people who say, "Can I tell you what happened to me?" And so what do we do for ourselves? What kind of support is there? Because sometimes that may bring up old stuff, whether it's your own experience or somebody close to your experience, or some of it's like we've already been talking about. Did I do this okay? What do I do? What's next? So can one of you, I know all of you could talk to, what can we do for people who are on the receiving end of trying to help somebody?
I think this is a really common question right now, right? Like how to support and get support as a supporter, which all of us, you know, probably will have that question at some point. And I guess part of it is the classic like self-care, right? We all know what to do for ourselves when we're overloaded, when we need a break, when we're at our emotional capacity of handling things. You know, taking a deep breath, taking a walk, doing those classic things that'll make us feel a bit better mentally and emotionally. The other thing, you know, that we talk about here at KCSARC all the time is you can always call the resource line as a supporter to get support for yourself. That's just a great resource for everybody to be able to, you know, commiserate, talk through things, get some support in that way. Getting your own therapy is always a good helpful, you know, use of your time. Those are the things that came to my mind. I think it'll depend on the person too, right? It'll depend on you. It'll depend on who disclosed to you and how much that's going to impact you.
Okay. I'm going to look at this. This will be our final question that just got popped up in the chat. And the question is a complicated one. What is a helpful response when someone discloses to a sexual assault to you, but is actively minimizing their own experience, shaming and blaming themselves? What's a helpful way to thread the needle of validating their feelings and experience, but not reinforcing those narratives? Who's going to take that on? We've got two therapists here and a legal advocate, all prevention experts as well.
I can do that. So, you know, I think part of one of the things about that response is going back, knowing that minimizing of their own experience, shaming, blaming themselves, that is a common response. And so that's typical. And those are the things that as a therapist, folks usually walk in with. So those are going to be things that may take some time to work through because those things are already messages they have been receiving through some means. So you can follow this baser protocol essentially without, I mean, you can still believe that they've been harmed. And you can, without questioning their experience, continue to support them in what they need, because what they may need in these moments is for you to repeatedly be there for them, as they may just be needing to talk through this themselves. Sometimes this experience of shame and self-blame, they just need to hear themselves talk this out loud, sometimes with somebody who's just going to sit and listen supportively, not tune them out, not question them, but be in silence with them as they talk this stuff through. Sometimes that can be a very easy way of doing it. You don't always feel like you have to say something. We tell our folks all the time, get very comfortable with sitting in silence. Sometimes just being with someone is very helpful, and allowing them to sort of work through at their own pace, especially if they're not in therapy. That might be your role, is you're the sounding board. You're the person who is going to sit in the room while they talk through their experience and wind up defining it for themselves. And maybe they come to some of these conclusions on their own. But again, that's a place for referral too. They can be talking to somebody who can help them work through these experiences, because those are common responses to abuse.
Yeah.
I know we're almost at time too, but one thing that I also see as really validating is following up. So not just leaving the disclosure for a one-time, okay, they told you this, and then you never circle back and check in and see how they're doing. Following up can be really validating and empowering too. Just checking in.
Good advice. Good advice. On that note, I want to just remind viewers too that our 24-hour resource line is here for exactly these kinds of questions. So don't hesitate to call us. Thank you. We've got that in the link. We'll send you out the link to the video, the podcast, the Baser model. Thank you, Chris, Hannah, and Jessica. We are so fortunate to have you with us. And thanks all of you for being on this call today. It's good knowing you're all out there. Have a great day. Bye-bye.